Clare O'Neill, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks for having me on the show, Sarah.
This afternoon, when the Greens waved through both your bills, were you surprised?
I was a bit surprised. It is a big about-face in the Green strategy here. For 2.5 years, everything that our government has tried to do on housing, the Greens have worked with Peter Dutton to block and delay, and that's had real consequences for Australians. They've obviously heard a really clear message from the electorate that that approach is not getting them anywhere, and I'm really pleased to see them come to the party on these bills before the Parliament.
Yet this morning you put out a very strong message that you were not going to negotiate with them anymore, particularly on the Help to Buy bill. Now, when did you decide to cease all negotiations with the Greens?
As I say, this has been going on for 2.5 years, and it is not just about these two bills that have come forward. Labor's landmark Housing Australia Future Fund, which is going to build 30,000 social and affordable homes, was delayed by the Greens for a year. So
but they got an outcome out of that?
Well, I've seen the pattern of behaviour go through, and I can see the politics being played. Now, there's a lot
let me just hold you there, because on that particular bill, they negotiated and they got an outcome. They would say they got a better deal.
I don't really agree with that characterisation. What I see is that they delayed the Housing Australia Future Fund by a year, Sarah. And one of the problems I have in dealings with the Greens is that you honestly feel sometimes like they have forgotten that there are real people at the end of their politicking. The consequence of their delay on that particular bill was that today, instead of giving keys to tenants for social and affordable homes, our government is still in contract negotiations with Housing Australia Future Fund winners. So delay is costly. I was a little bit surprised to see the Greens make such a radical change, but what I want in this Parliament is for us to work with good faith actors. That's not how I perceive the Greens' behaviour up to this point.
By today, the Greens were asking for, they had taken off the table changes to negative gearing, changes to capital gains. They were asking for 25,000 extra houses in the HAFF and indeed a request supported by the sector. So when did you decide to stop talking to them?
Well, I don't agree that that request was supported by the sector. Most of what the Greens do is not supported by the sector because they don't see them as good faith actors.
I'm just going to stop you there because the housing sector does want to see more houses built. They're pleased about the houses that were built, but I think it's not right to say that the sector does not want to see extra houses
Of course,
built.
Sarah, but that's not actually what the Greens asked for in the negotiation. So we're a bit in the weeds here, but the way that they asked the government to do this was both unlawful, unworkable and not value for money for Australians. So back to your question about when we came to this position, we have been sitting for a year waiting for the Greens to come forward and support a bill that I know they support. I know it because it was in their election platform for the 2022 election. They've been politicking. I finally got a letter last week that I was hoping was a real offer to make an arrangement with the Greens. Instead, it was just more of the same chicanery and charades, and that's when the government made a really clear decision. We're not going to continue this ridiculous display of drama. We're a real government that is going to make real change for real people, and the Greens are either going to come with us or they are going to show the Australian people that everything they have said about housing in the last 2.5 years has been untrue.
And yet, at the same time, there is a request in the housing sector, notwithstanding that a decision has been made that will see housing built for people who need them. Nonetheless, the sector is asking for more houses to be built, which does correspond to what the Greens were asking for, not unlawful, as you have characterised it. So when did you make the decision that you would not listen to that request from the Greens to see more housing for people who needed it built? These
requests from the Greens have never been in good faith, Sarah, and we know that we're not in good faith because this is a bill that they have never been able to identify any problem with. It was part of their election platform in 2022. Here we are a year later where the Greens have delayed and blocked action, and the consequence of that is that we would have had 10,000 nurses and aged care workers in home ownership right now, but for the behaviour of the Greens. So it's really important for people to see this. Despite everything that the Greens have said about housing in this country in the last 2.5 years, the net effect of their presence in this Parliament has been to delay action on social and affordable housing, to delay home ownership and to result in more homelessness.
There has been some other amendments suggested, particularly for the second of the bills that the Greens surprisingly agreed to support this afternoon. Now, in that case, we've got an unusual combination. We've got the Property Council with community housing providers and Shelter proposing changes to the bill, will you listen to those experts who've come together to ask for changes to some of the tax thresholds, for example, that they think are too beneficial to developers? Will you listen to their expertise before putting these bills to the Parliament now?
Look, we're having good negotiations and discussions with other crossbenchers who have been working constructively with the government over a long period of time on housing, on these bills and on other matters that we've dealt with. So we'll continue those conversations and perhaps have more to say later this week.
Just on the wider politics here, last week you passed your aged care reform. You've now got what looks like passage of these two very important housing bills. How much does that change the electoral politics for the government?
Honestly, Sarah, I haven't even thought about the politics of this.
Is that possible that you don't think about the politics?
Well,
You're a senior member of the cabinet.
Of course, I think about politics every day.
Yes.
The point I'm making to you is that the Greens made an announcement several hours ago that they're going to support these bills. My first thought is not to the politics, it is to the people who we're going to be able to help as a consequence of this. Our government wants to deliver more home ownership opportunities. We want to deliver more social and affordable housing, and we want to deliver better rental opportunities for Australians, and these bills will give us that opportunity. That's what matters to me.
Yes, I appreciate that. At the same time, it gives the government a narrative that it can get things done.
Well, of course the government can get things done, Sarah, and I don't think that's exemplified just in the last couple of months. Our government's been tremendously impactful in every area, whether you look from environment to health to the tax cuts that we've delivered for every Australian household, the work we've done on cost of living. We've done a lot for Australians over the last 2.5 years, but there's plenty more to do on housing just as much as anywhere else. And I want people to know they're going to an election here with a really clear choice on housing between a party of protest, a party of pessimism in the Liberals, we haven't got to them yet, and a party of progress. We're trying to make a big change to how housing works in our country, and we are going to have a lot more to say about the work in the second term ahead.
Having the Greens taken out of, the Greens' intransigence on the matter of housing taken out of the picture, does that now make it slightly less likely that an early election is on the cards?
Look, I'll leave those deliberations for the Prime Minister.
Clare O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah, for having me.
As the song goes, you've got to know when to hold them, you've got to know when to fold them, you've got to know when to walk away and know when to run. Green spokesman for housing, Max Chandler-Mather, joins me now. Max, why did you end the brinkmanship with Labor?
Well, there comes a point where you realise you've pushed as hard as you can, and we really tried to push Labor on acting on soaring rents, on phasing out the tax handouts for property investors or establishing a public developer to build genuinely affordable housing. And what we've decided is to pass these two housing bills and take that fight to the next election. Well, we'll be working hard to keep Dutton out and pushing Labor to act on capping rent increases, on phasing out negative gearing, which will help hundreds of thousands of renters in affordable housing.
So that's all of the Greens' policies. But the question is, why did you decide to end the brinkmanship with Labor? Is it because it was very clear to you that you were going to face electoral backlash for not helping some of the most deserving members of our community get affordable housing?
We went into this process assuming that we'd be able to get a similar positive outcome that we got last year on the Housing Australia Future Fund, where we secured $3 billion of extra investment in social housing, 6 times what Labor originally wanted to spend. That was really positive. And we had assumed that a similar process would happen this time. And look, we are disappointed that at the end, Labor didn't want to shift at all and felt like they were really abandoning a lot of renters who really need help right now. And of course, we were disappointed about that. But we also got close on negative gearing. They costed that policy. And that would have been the most positive, genuine shift in housing policy in generations in Australia.
But we're talking about
so many renters.
We're talking about something that didn't happen. So let me put it in these terms. You're not denying, are you, that electoral politics changed your hardline position, are you?
I feel like our position's been pretty consistent in this term of Parliament.
But it changed today.
I think the only thing that changed in this instance was that Labor decided to refuse to negotiate this time, and that is disappointing. But again, over a course of this term of Parliament, $3 billion for social housing and other areas, we've secured a right to disconnect for workers and shift workers in particular so they can switch off when they go home.
So are you happy with the outcome today?
Of course not. We're in a massive housing crisis. There are millions of people, 3 million Australians on the brink of homelessness. And it's been a real struggle to push the government to take this crisis seriously enough. And the reality is, at the end of this term of Parliament, we'll have passed all of Labor's housing bills. And they do need to take a bit of responsibility for the fact that we'll still be in a massive housing crisis. There are single mums right now choosing between feeding the kids and paying the rent. And we could have got them into social housing if Labor had agreed to work with us on building more social housing.
The reason I framed the question in that way is not because I anticipated you to be happy, but What I want to understand is whether you fully support the decision of the Greens leadership to waive these bills today.
Absolutely. I made the proposal to pass both of these bills because I reached the conclusion that we had pushed as far as we could in this instance, and that really the solution was to go to the next election with our housing platform. And if people agree with capping rents or phasing out negative gearing or building more public and affordable housing, well, then they know they can vote Greens to keep out Dutton and push Labor to act in those areas. And it's clear in this democracy, we're going to have to rely on the Australian people to send that message to Labor.
Now, you've been such a tough advocate of the hardline approach with this government and to this particular legislation. Did you just get a lesson in pragmatic politics?
I think we've been pragmatic throughout this term. Remember last year I copped a bit of criticism from some people for pushing to pass the Housing Australia Future Fund once we had secured that $3 billion of investment in social and affordable housing. Because again, it is always disappointing when we're in Parliament and we aren't able to tackle the housing crisis. There's so many people right now who are doing it really tough, and we know our housing policies would help millions of people, but at the end of the day, we're not the government. So all we can do is put good ideas to the government, push for them to adopt them, but ultimately it's their decision if they decide not to take the sort of bold action that I really think we need on the housing crisis.
Was the allegation that you were helping Peter Dutton too harmful to Greens' prospects?
Well, I would argue, and I would put it to Labor, that the way to stop Dutton from becoming Prime Minister is to address people's direct material concerns, including the housing crisis. Part of the reason we were pushing so hard is because a lot of people are hurting, millions of people. And if we cap rents or if we phase out negative gearing, so a lot of people could get into home ownership for the first time, not just 10,000, hundreds of thousands, or start building enough genuinely affordable housing so we can start to tackle the scale of the crisis, I think that would stop Dutton becoming Prime Minister, because all of a sudden they'd have a government and people would have a government who are in their corner helping them. And I think that's the point of politics.
But nonetheless, back to the notion of politics being pragmatic, are the Greens better placed now to go into an election as a party prepared to compromise to get an outcome?
Yeah, and I think we can talk about all the compromises and outcomes we've secured, the $3 billion for social housing. I think putting renters on the national agenda, I don't think that we would be talking about as a country the plight of renters in this country if it weren't for our push on that. Right to disconnect, improvements to environmental laws. And I think we're in a good position because we'll be going to an election with a housing policy platform that enjoys broad popular support.
Just briefly, you don't feel you're letting down your base of young voters?
Every day that we don't solve the housing crisis, I feel like I've let them down a little bit, absolutely, because that's the point of politics, and I feel it every day. I come from a generation of people in my generation who for the first time are probably going to be worse off than our parents. I feel that acutely. I have friends who've been kicked out of their homes because they can't afford the rent or have given up on ever being able to buy a home. And it hurts me a lot, actually, to see that. I find it really hard. But the reality is that I still feel hope, because I feel like we've shifted the national conversation over the last few years. I feel like we'll be going into an election where there'll be a lot of pressure on all the parties now to take real action on the housing crisis, and I think that's a positive thing.
I appreciate that. That sounded like a real answer. Max Chandler-Mather, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.